The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked earth of the Sonoran Desert. Sarah Mitchell's lips were split and bleeding, her throat so parched that swallowing felt like dragging sandpaper across raw flesh. She had stopped. Sweating hours ago, a dangerous sign her body was shutting down. The rope burns on her wrists had turned purple, evidence of her desperate struggle against the men who had left her here to die. 24 hours earlier, Sarah had been a successful investigative journalist from Phoenix, following a lead about human trafficking operations near the Mexican border. Her source had promised evidence that would expose a network reaching into the highest levels of state government. Instead, she found herself ambushed at a remote gas station, drugged and driven deep into the desert by 3 men who made it clear she had asked too many questions. They had taken her phone. There's her identification, everything except the clothes on her back. Before leaving, the leader, a man with cold grey eyes and a scar running from his left ear to his jaw, had smiled. "The desert is patient," he said. "It'll take its time with you. By tomorrow night, there won't be enough left for the coyotes." Now, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Sarah knew he was right. Her legs had given out hours ago, leaving her crawling across the burning sand. Every movement sent waves of agony through her dehydrated muscles. She had tried to find shade, but the sparse vegetation offered little relief. The Joshua trees stood like twisted sentinels, mocking her suffering with their ability to thrive where she was dying. In her delirium, she thought she heard the sound of hoofbeats. Sarah laughed, a harsh, croaking sound. Her mind was playing tricks on her now, conjuring up fantasies of rescue. She collapsed face first into the sand, no longer having the strength to lift her head. This was how it would end, she thought, another missing person who ventured too close to dangerous truths. But the hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied by the soft snorting of a horse. A shadow fell across her prone form, blocking the relentless sun. Strong hands gently turned her over, and through her blurred vision she saw a figure silhouetted against the dying light. A man in worn leather, his face obscured by the brim of a weathered hat. He didn't speak, just lifted a canteen to her lips. The water was warm, but to Sarah it tasted like salvation. He gave her only small sips at first, knowing too much too fast could kill her. His movements were practiced, efficient. This wasn't the first time he had found someone dying in the desert. When she could focus enough to see his face, she noticed eyes the color of desert sage, set in a face weathered by sun and wind. A week's worth of stubble covered his jaw, and a faded scar ran across his right cheekbone. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing, settling her onto his horse with surprising gentleness. She wanted to ask who he was, why he was helping her, but her voice wouldn't come. He mounted behind her, one arm securing her against his chest, and urged the horse forward with a soft click of his tongue. They rode through the gathering darkness, the man navigating by stars and landmarks invisible to her untrained eyes. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, aware only of the steady rhythm of the horse's gait and the solid presence of the stranger who had appeared like a ghost from the desert itself. She woke briefly when they stopped at a hidden spring, where he refilled his canteens and let the horse drink. The moon had risen, casting everything in silver light. He helped her drink more water, then produced a strip of dried meat from his saddlebag. "Chew slow," he said, his voice rough from disuse. They were the first words he had spoken. As they continued their journey, Sarah's journalist instincts began to reassert themselves despite her condition. Who was this man who rode alone through the desert, finding people left to die? His clothes were practical but worn, his gear minimal but well-maintained. Everything about him suggested someone who lived outside society's boundaries, yet he had risked exposure to save her. They reached his camp as dawn broke, a carefully concealed spot in a canyon where ancient petroglyphs decorated the rock. Walls, a small adobe structure, barely more than a shelter, blended so perfectly with its surroundings that it was nearly invisible. He had built it himself, she would later learn, using techniques passed down through generations. Inside, as it was sparse but clean, he laid her on a narrow cot, then set about treating her injuries with the same quiet efficiency he had shown throughout their journey. Aloe for her burned skin, a poultice for her rope burns, and a bitter tea that eased her pain and helped her sleep. When she woke again, the sun was high, and he was sitting outside the door, cleaning a rifle with methodical precision. She watched him through the doorway, noting the way he constantly scanned the horizon, alert to any threat. Whatever had driven him to this solitary existence had taught him hard lessons about survival. "Thank you," she managed to say, her voice still hoarse. He glanced at her, nodded once, then returned to his task. "Rest," he said. "You're not strong enough yet." But Sarah had questions burning inside her. "Who are you?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he said, "Someone who understands what it's like to be left for dead." Over the next 3 days, Sarah slowly regained her strength under the stranger's care. She learned his name was Jake Winters, though he offered little else. About himself, he moved through his daily routines with practiced efficiency, checking trap lines, maintaining his gear, and always watching the horizon. At night, he would sit by the small fire outside, sometimes playing a battered harmonica with surprising skill. On the 4th day, strong enough to walk short distances, Sarah found him saddling his horse in the pre-dawn darkness. "Where are you going?" she asked. "Supplies," he said, not meeting her eyes. "Stay inside. Don't light any fires. There's food and water. I'll be back by nightfall." "Jake, wait." She touched his arm, feeling him tense under her fingers. "Those men who left me out there, they'll be looking for me. They can't afford to let me live." He finally looked at her, and she saw something flicker in those sage-colored eyes. "I know," he said simply. "That's why I'm going to town." Before she could ask what he meant, he was gone, disappearing into the desert like smoke. Sarah spent the day alternating between rest and worry. She explored the small shelter, finding little that revealed anything about her rescuer. A few books, mostly about desert survival and Native American history. A photograph, carefully wrapped in oilcloth, showing a younger Jake with a woman and small girl, all smiling. The edges were worn from handling. She was studying the petroglyphs on the canyon walls when she heard horses approaching. Her heart hammered as she pressed herself against the rock, but it was Jake who rounded the corner, leading a second horse loaded with supplies. Relief flooded through her, followed quickly by curiosity when she noticed the grim set of his jaw. "They're looking for you," he said without preamble as he unloaded the horses. "3 men have been asking questions in Gila Bend. They're offering money for information about a woman matching your description." Sarah's stomach clenched. "Oh, I need to get to Phoenix. I have evidence hidden there that can stop them." Jake shook his head. "You go back now. You're dead. They have people watching your apartment, your office. I heard them talking at Murphy's store. They know you're alive." "How do you know all this?" He gave her a long look. "People talk around someone they think is just another desert rat. They don't see me as a threat." He paused, then added, "They're wrong." That night, as they shared a simple meal of beans and cornbread, Sarah finally asked the question that had been burning inside her. What happened to them? A woman and girl in the photograph. Jake's hand stilled. For a moment, she thought he would refuse to answer or tell her to mind her own business. Instead, he stared into the fire and began to speak. Maria was my wife. Emma was our daughter. 6 years ago, I was a different man. Owned a small ranch near Tucson, raised horses. We were happy. His voice was steady, but Sarah could hear the pain underneath. "I testified against some men who were poisoning water supplies to force ranchers to sell cheap. Thought the law would protect us." He took a drink from his canteen before continuing. "They came at night. I was in town getting supplies. By the time I got back—" He trailed off, but Sarah didn't need him to finish. The anguish in his eyes told the story. The law did nothing, said there wasn't enough evidence. The men who did it walked free, laughing. His hands clenched into fists. "So I took my own justice, tracked them down, one by one. The law called me a murderer, put a price on my head. I've been out here ever since." Sarah absorbed this information, understanding now why he had saved her. He knew what it was like to lose everything to men who thought themselves untouchable. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "Don't be sorry," he replied. "Be smart. These men who want you dead, they're connected. You can't fight them alone." "Then help me," Sarah said, leaning forward. "You know this desert. You know how to survive. Help me get my evidence and expose them." Jake studied her for a long moment. "You don't know what you're asking. I'm a wanted man. Being seen with me puts a target on your back." "I already have a target on my back," Sarah countered. "At least with you, I have a chance." He was quiet for so long that the fire burned down to embers. Finally, he nodded. "Tell me everything. Start from the beginning." Sarah told him about her investigation, about the trafficking network that moved people across the border like cattle. She explained how her source had provided documents showing payoffs to judges, police, even a state senator. The evidence was hidden in a safety deposit box in Phoenix, but she needed her key, which was concealed in her apartment. As she spoke, Jake listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions. His tactical mind, honed by years of survival, began forming a plan. "Your apartment will be watched, but they won't expect you to come from the desert. There's an old smuggler's route that comes out near South Mountain. We could get you in and out without being seen." "We?" Sarah asked, hope rising in her chest. "You saved my life when you could have left me to die," Jake said. "I don't abandon debts." They spent the next 2 days preparing. Jake taught her how to move silently across the desert floor, how to read the signs of surveillance, how to become invisible in plain sight. He was a patient teacher, correcting her mistakes without judgment. Sarah found herself studying him as much as his lessons, fascinated by this man who had chosen exile over injustice. On their last night before leaving for Phoenix, they sat outside watching the stars. The desert was alive with small sounds, the hunting calls of owls, the rustle of small creatures in the brush. Sarah felt more alive than she had in years, despite the danger that awaited them. "After this is over," she said, "what will you do?" Jake was quiet for a moment. "Same as always. Survive." "That's not living," Sarah said softly. "That's just existing." He turned to look at her, and in the moonlight she could see the walls he had built around himself. "Sometimes existing is all we get." "Maybe," Sarah said, "or maybe sometimes the desert gives us a second chance." They left before dawn, taking both horses and moving like shadows across the desert landscape. Jake had plotted a route that would take them through terrain too rough for vehicles, following paths known only to smugglers and the desperate. Sarah marveled at his knowledge of every hidden spring, every concealed passage through the rocky outcroppings. On the second night, camped in a narrow canyon, Jake suddenly held up his hand for silence. Sarah froze, hearing nothing but her own heartbeat. Then she caught it, the distant sound of engines. Jake quickly doused their small fire, and they pressed themselves against the canyon wall as light swept across the ridge above them. "Border Patrol," Sarah whispered. Jake shook his head slightly. "Wrong pattern. Those are hunters, and they're not looking for immigrants." They waited in tense silence for an hour before the lights finally moved on. Jake's expression was grim. They're expanding their search. Someone talked. They pushed harder the next day, reaching the outskirts of Phoenix as darkness fell. The city lights created an orange glow on the horizon, a stark contrast to the star-filled skies of the desert. Jake led them to a run-down motel on the south side, paying cash for a room under a false name. Sarah barely recognized herself. In the cracked mirror, the desert had changed her, leaving her skin bronzed and her eyes harder. She looked like someone who had walked through fire and survived. Jake stood by the window, watching the parking lot with the same vigilance. He showed in the desert. "Tomorrow night," he said, "your apartment building has a service entrance that connects to the parking garage. Security cameras, but I know someone who owes me a favor. He can create a blind spot for 10 minutes. That's all the time you'll have." "I'll only need 5, Sarah said, with more confidence than she felt. Jake turned from the window to study her. "You've changed," he observed. "The desert does that," Sarah replied, echoing words he had once said to her. The next day dragged by with agonizing slowness. Jake left twice, returning with supplies and information. The men hunting Sarah had grown desperate, increasing their reward and expanding their network of informants. Time was running out. As darkness fell, they prepared for the mission. Jake provided her with dark clothing and a baseball cap to obscure her face. He would wait with the horses at a prearranged location while she retrieved the key. If she wasn't back in 30 minutes, he would assume the worst and disappear back into the desert. "Or take this," he said, pressing a small revolver into her hand. "Just in case." Sarah looked at the weapon, then at him. "Jake, I need to tell you something. Whatever happens tonight, you saved more than just my life out there. You reminded me why I became a journalist in the first place, to fight for people who can't fight for themselves." Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the armor he wore. "Ma, just come back alive," he said roughly. The service entrance was exactly where Jake had said it would be. Sarah's heart pounded as she slipped through the shadows, every sense hyper-alert. The blind spot in the cameras gave her access to the stairwell and she climbed to the 7th floor, avoiding the elevators. Her apartment door showed no signs of forced entry, but she knew that meant nothing. These men were professionals. She entered carefully, the revolver ready. The apartment was as she had left it, but she could sense the violation of her space. Drawers had been carefully searched and replaced. Her computer was missing, and the subtle disarray told her they had been thorough. The key was hidden inside a hollowed-out book on her shelf, a cliché that had worked precisely because it was so obvious. She pocketed it and turned to leave, then froze. Footsteps in the hallway, multiple sets, moving with purpose. They had been waiting. Sarah's mind raced. The window led to a fire escape, but they would expect that. Instead, she slipped into the bathroom, standing on the toilet to push up a ceiling tile. Jake had taught her to always look for unconventional exits. She pulled herself up into the crawl space just as her front door burst open. She could hear them searching below, cursing when they found the apartment empty. Moving carefully through the dusty space, she made her way to the adjacent apartment, dropping down into an elderly neighbor's bathroom. The woman's scream was cut short when Sarah pressed a finger to her lips, showing her press credentials. "Please," Sarah whispered, "they're trying to kill me because I'm exposing human traffickers. I just need to get to the stairwell." The elderly woman, God bless her, nodded and pointed to her front door. Sarah slipped out and made it to the stairs, taking them 3 at a time. Behind her, she could hear shouts as they realized she had escaped. She burst through the service entrance and ran for the rendezvous point, her lungs burning. Jake was there, holding the horses steady despite the chaos erupting from the building. Sarah vaulted onto her mount with an agility she wouldn't have possessed a week ago. They rode hard through the back alleys and industrial areas Jake had scouted, the sound of sirens growing distant behind them. They didn't stop until they reached the desert, where Jake finally allowed the horses to slow. Sarah was shaking with adrenaline, but she held up the key triumphantly. "Got it. You did good," Jake said, and coming from him, it felt like the highest praise. They made camp in a different location, Jake unwilling to risk returning to his canyon hideout yet. As they sat by the fire, Sarah noticed him, absently rubbing his shoulder. "You're hurt," she said, moving closer to examine him. "It's nothing. Old wound that acts up sometimes." But he didn't pull away as she checked the shoulder, finding a poorly healed bullet scar. "From when you went after them?" she asked softly. He nodded. "The last one got a shot off before I finished. It..." Sarah met his eyes. "I'm going to finish what you started, Jake. These men, the ones I'm after, they're the same kind who took your family. They think they're untouchable because they have money and power, but they're wrong." "It won't bring them back," Jake said quietly. "And taking down bad men won't fill the hole they left." "No," Sarah agreed, "but maybe it means other families won't have to suffer the same loss. Maybe that's enough." They sat in comfortable silence, two damaged souls who had found each other in the vast emptiness of the desert. Tomorrow they would plan their next move to retrieve the evidence. But tonight they were simply two people who understood that sometimes the only way to heal was to keep fighting for those who couldn't. The safety deposit box was in a bank in downtown Phoenix, surrounded by cameras and security. Jake spent 2 days conducting surveillance, memorizing patterns and identifying weaknesses. Sarah watched him work, impressed by his methodical approach. The wild-eyed vigilante, the law painted him as bore no resemblance to this careful, strategic thinker. On the 3rd day, he presented his plan. The bank has a 2-minute window during the shift change at 2:47 p.m. The lobby guard steps outside for a smoke while the replacement is still in the break room. "You go in looking like a businesswoman. No one will question you. I'll create a distraction if needed." "What kind of distraction?" Sarah asked. Jake's smile was grim. The kind that makes people look the other way." Sarah dressed in clothes Jake had somehow procured, a professional pantsuit that made her look like any other Phoenix executive. She barely recognized herself in the mirror. The desert survivor was hidden beneath the corporate facade, but she was still there, coiled and ready. The plan went smoothly until Sarah was inside the vault. As she opened the box and retrieved the USB drive containing her evidence, alarms began blaring, not bank alarms, but fire alarms. Through the chaos, she saw Jake outside, calmly, walking away from a food truck that had mysteriously caught fire in front of the bank. In the confusion, Sarah slipped out unnoticed, the evidence secure in her pocket. She met Jake 3 blocks away, where he waited with a stolen sedan. "Borrowed it from someone who won't miss it for a few hours," he explained. They drove to a motel on the outskirts of the city, where Sarah used a burner laptop to verify the evidence was intact. The files were all there, documenting years of human trafficking, money laundering, and murder. Names, dates, financial records, everything needed to bring down the network. "This is it," she breathed. "This is enough to destroy them." "Now comes the hard part," Jake said, "getting it to someone who can't be bought." Sarah had been thinking about this. "I have a contact at the FBI, someone I trust, but we need to be careful how we approach her." They spent the night planning, and Sarah was struck again by how well they worked together. Jake's tactical mind complemented her investigative instincts perfectly. Somewhere between the desert rescue and this moment, they had become a team. The next morning, Sarah made contact with her FBI source, Agent Diana Chen. They arranged to meet at a public location, a busy coffee shop where violence would be too risky. Jake positioned himself across the street, watching for threats. Agent Chen arrived alone, as promised. Sarah had worked with her before on smaller stories, and she knew the woman's reputation for integrity. She slid the USB drive across the table, along with a written summary of its contents. "You do, this is bigger than you know," Chen said after scanning the summary. "We've been trying to crack this network for years. This evidence, it changes everything." "There's a condition," Sarah said. "The man who helped me get this, he needs immunity for past actions." "Full immunity, no questions asked." Chen's eyes narrowed. "That's not easy to arrange. Who is he?" "Someone who lost everything to men like these and took justice into his own hands. He saved my life and risked his freedom to help me. Get this evidence. Without him, I'd be dead in the desert." Chen was quiet for a long moment. "I'll need to make some calls. Can you stay safe for 48 hours? Sarah nodded. "We'll manage." As she left the coffee shop, Sarah felt the weight of what they had accomplished, but she also knew the next 2 days would be the most dangerous. The network would know their evidence was compromised. They would be desperate. Jake was waiting at the car, his expression unreadable. "How did it go?" "She'll help, but we need to stay hidden for 2 days," he nodded. "I know a place." The place turned out to be an abandoned ranger station in the Superstition Mountains, accessible only by horseback. They spent the ride in comfortable silence, the desert spreading out around them like an old friend. That night, as they sat watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Jake spoke unexpectedly. "After Maria and Emma died, I thought my life was over. I came out here to die, really. Just took longer than I expected." Sarah waited, knowing he needed to say this at his own pace. "But the desert wouldn't let me die. It kept providing. Just enough water, just enough food, like it was telling me I wasn't done yet." He turned to look at her. "When I found you out there, it was like the desert was giving me a chance to save someone, even if I couldn't save them." "You did save me," Sarah said softly, "in more ways than one." "You saved me too," Jake admitted. "It reminded me there's still something worth fighting for besides revenge." They sat closer together as the temperature dropped, sharing warmth and something deeper. Two broken people who had found wholeness in each other's company. The next morning brought unwelcome news. Jake's police scanner, solar-powered and hidden at the station, crackled with reports of a massive manhunt. Their location had been compromised. Someone in law enforcement was feeding information to the network. "We need to move," Jake said, already packing their essential supplies. But as they prepared to leave, vehicles appeared on the horizon, kicking up dust clouds as they approached. They were trapped. "There's another way," Jake said, leading her to a narrow crack in the rock face. "Old mine shaft. It comes out 2 miles north. Take the evidence and go." "Not without you," Sarah said firmly. "They want me alive for questioning. You, they'll kill on sight." He pressed the USB backup into her hand. "This is bigger than us. Go." Before she could protest further, he kissed her, a desperate, fierce kiss that said everything they hadn't had time to voice. Then he was gone, walking out to meet the approaching vehicles with his hands visible but ready. Sarah wanted to follow, to fight beside him. But she knew he was right. The evidence had to survive. She plunged into the darkness of the mine shaft, using the small flashlight Jake had given her. Behind her, she could hear shouts and then gunfire. The shaft was a nightmare of narrow passages and unstable supports. But she pushed forward. Driven by Jake's sacrifice, she emerged, gasping into daylight just as helicopters appeared overhead. Not law enforcement, she realized with relief, but FBI. Agent Chen was in the lead vehicle that picked her up. "We tracked your phone," she explained. "Where's your friend?" "Back there," Sarah gasped. "They were closing in. He bought me time." Chen immediately radioed coordinates, and the helicopters wheeled toward the ranger station. Sarah could only wait and pray as the radio chattered with operational updates. Then finally, "We have him. One survivor in custody. Multiple hostiles down. He's wounded but stable." Sarah felt her knees buckle with relief. Chen steadied her. "He's a fighter, your friend. Took down 4 of them before we arrived." The next hours blurred together, debriefings, medical checks, and finally, Sarah was allowed to see Jake. He was in a hospital bed, bandaged but alert. His eyes found hers immediately. "You made it," he said, his voice rough. "So did you," she replied, taking his hand. Agent Chen appeared in the doorway. "The evidence is solid. We're making arrests across 3 states. The network is finished." She looked at Jake. "And your immunity deal is approved. Your slate is clean." Jake closed his eyes, and Sarah saw the weight of 6 years lift from his shoulders. Later, as Sarah sat beside his bed, Jake spoke quietly. "And what happens now?" "Now," Sarah said, "we figure out how to live instead of just survive together." He asked, vulnerability creeping into his voice. "Together," she confirmed. 6 months later, Sarah published her exposé, winning a Pulitzer Prize for investigative journalism. The trafficking network was dismantled, with dozens of convictions. But the real victory, she knew, was more personal. Jake had returned to ranching, this time in Montana, far from the desert that had been both prison and sanctuary. Sarah split her time between investigative work and the ranch, finding peace in the simple rhythm of caring for horses and land. On quiet evenings, they would sit on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains. The ghosts of the past were still there, always would be, but they no longer defined the future. "Do you miss it?" Sarah asked one evening. "The desert?" Jake considered the question. "Sometimes. It gave me you, after all." Sarah smiled, leaning into his warmth. "The desert gave us each other, and in that gift they had both found their way back to life.